Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I developed chronic pain issues about 5 years ago. Some days are better than others, but when it gets bad, even walking short distances becomes a real challenge. That's why I have a disabled parking placard. The thing is, I look perfectly healthy on the outside. You wouldn't know anything was wrong with me unless I told you. My husband served in the military for 12 years. He did multiple tours during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. Anyone who knows anything about military service knows that when you deploy overseas, you wear a patch on your sleeve showing which unit you served with. No deployment means no patch. It's as simple as that. So there I was, having one of my really bad days. The kind where every step feels like walking on broken glass. I needed to go grocery shopping though. We were running low on everything at home. I pulled into the supermarket parking lot and found a handicapped spot right near the entrance. Perfect. Getting out of the car is always a slow process on days like this. I have to take my time, adjust my position, and sometimes wait for a wave of pain to pass. As I was doing my usual routine, I noticed 3 soldiers standing behind my van. I didn't think much of it at first. We live near a base, so seeing service members is pretty common around here. But then one of them, a private first class who couldn't have been more than 20, started running his mouth. He yelled at me, saying that these spots were for people who actually needed them. His 2 buddies were standing there nodding like bobbleheads, probably feeling brave because they had strength in numbers. The private first class continued his tirade, accusing me of being lazy and telling me that these spots were meant for veterans and disabled people. I took a good look at him, particularly at his uniform. Just as I suspected, no deployment patch on his sleeve. This kid hadn't seen a day of combat in his life, and here he was lecturing me about disabilities. I pointed out that I noticed his sleeve was pretty naked. His face scrunched up in confusion, so I explained that his lack of a deployment patch meant he hadn't served overseas yet, and suggested that maybe he shouldn't talk about things he had no experience with. The confusion on his face started turning to embarrassment as he realized I knew what I was talking about. I continued telling him that while we were on the subject of things he knew nothing about, he should learn about invisible disabilities, pointing out that many of his fellow soldiers suffer from wounds that aren't visible to the eye. The 2 friends who had been backing him up suddenly found the ground very interesting. One of them cleared his throat and mumbled that they should probably get going. The other quickly agreed, saying they were going to be late. They practically sprinted to their car, leaving their buddy to face the music alone. The private first class's face had turned bright red by this point. He started stammering, trying to form words but failing miserably. I pressed on, asking if he hadn't considered that someone who looks fine on the outside might actually be disabled, and if he hadn't thought about minding his own business. He tried to apologize, but I wasn't finished. I asked him to think about how many wounded warriors come through his base, how many look perfectly fine until you see them limping on bad days, and how many are battling pain that no one can see. He kept stammering apologies, shifting from foot to foot, clearly wanting to escape but not knowing how to extract himself from the situation. I could have kept going. There was plenty more I could have said about making assumptions and respecting people's privacy, but I think he'd learned his lesson. I gave him one final piece of advice, suggesting that he think twice before confronting someone about their disability status again, reminding him that he never knows who he's talking to or what their story is. He managed one final meek, "Yes, ma'am," before practically running away. I watched him go, shaking my head. I doubt that young private first class will be policing any more handicapped spots in the near future. My daughter later told me I should have said even more, but I think I got my point across just fine. I've lived in this neighborhood for about 5 years now. My son and I moved here after my divorce, looking for a fresh start. The house was perfect. Nice yard, good school district, and mostly friendly neighbors. Mostly, except for the woman next door. From day one, she made it clear she thought she owned the entire street. Her kid was about the same age as mine, but he was difficult. He'd constantly barge into our yard uninvited, break my son's toys, and his mother would always defend him, saying boys will be boys. I tried being neighborly at first, but after the third time her son destroyed my garden and she refused to even apologize, I started keeping my distance. My son was turning 10 and I wanted to make it special. The past few years had been rough on him with a divorce and moving, but he'd finally made some good friends at school. I planned a superhero-themed party in our backyard, complete with games, a bounce house, and a professional face painter. I invited his whole class. Well, almost the whole class. I didn't invite the neighbor's kid. The morning of the party, I was setting everything up when my neighbor came stomping over. She commented that she'd noticed I was setting up for a party. I confirmed it was my son's birthday today. She then claimed she hadn't received an invitation for her son and suggested it must have gotten lost in the mail. I told her straight out that it hadn't gotten lost. I simply hadn't sent one. She was shocked and demanded to know how I dared exclude her son, who lived right next door. I explained that after the last playdate incident where her son had pushed mine off the swing and she dismissed it as just playing, I wasn't comfortable having him around. She called me ridiculous, saying they were just children and that her son was sensitive and would be devastated seeing all the kids having fun without him. I stood my ground and told her it was my decision. She stormed off, muttering something about stuck-up parents and teaching me a lesson. I should have taken that threat more seriously. The party started at 2 p.m. The kids were having a blast, running around in their superhero costumes, jumping in the bounce house, getting their faces painted. The parents were chatting and everything was perfect. That's when we heard the first thud. An arrow had embedded itself in the bounce house, thankfully not hitting anyone. Before we could process what was happening, another arrow whizzed past my head and stuck into a tree. Everyone started screaming and ducking for cover. I looked toward where the arrows were coming from and saw Karen standing on her second-floor balcony with a crossbow. She was screaming that if her son couldn't enjoy the party, no one would, and that we should have thought about the consequences of being inconsiderate. One of the parents had already called the police. We were all huddled behind tables and garden furniture, trying to keep the terrified kids calm. Karen kept shooting arrows and screaming about how we were disturbing her afternoon with our noise and laughter. Police sirens wailed in the distance. When Karen saw the police cars pulling up instead of surrendering, she turned her crossbow on them. Bad move. Really bad move. The police ordered her to drop her weapon, but she refused, yelling that they couldn't tell her what to do and that it was her property. She actually shot an arrow at one of the police cars. Within seconds, the officers had their weapons drawn. They managed to access her house through the back door while she was distracted yelling at the officers in front. She tried to resist arrest, kicking and screaming about her rights and how we were all conspiring against her. It took 3 officers to get her into the police car. Her son was at his father's place for the weekend, thank God. The police took statements from everyone. Turns out she'd been drinking since morning, furious about the party. They found dozens of empty beer cans in her house, along with the crossbow, which, surprise, surprise, she didn't have a permit for. She ended up being charged with multiple counts of attempted assault with a deadly weapon, endangering minors, resisting arrest, and assaulting police officers. The judge wasn't amused by her tearful explanation that she was just protecting her son's feelings. She got 8 years in prison. Her ex-husband got full custody of their son and moved away shortly after. The party was obviously ruined, but we had a do-over the following weekend. This time we rented an indoor venue. The kids now had an even more exciting story to tell, how they survived a real-life villain attack at a superhero party. My son says it was his most memorable birthday ever, though I could have done without a near-death experience. The house next door was sold to a lovely retired couple who bring us cookies every Christmas. They've never once tried to shoot arrows at us, which I consider a major upgrade in the neighbor department. Let me paint you a picture of how I ended up being labeled as a neighborhood menace for checks notes, walking without a phone in my hand. I've been on this whole weight loss journey for the past few months, Nothing fancy, just trying to make better choices. One of my rules is that if I want junk food, I have to walk to get it. It's actually been working pretty well. I've lost 15 pounds so far, and I get to enjoy my treats guilt-free because hey, at least I worked for them. I've been living in this neighborhood for 6 years now. It's not perfect. Most of my neighbors are the typical suburban noise machines. You know the type. Loud music at odd hours, kids screaming in pools during summer, and the occasional 3 a.m. car alarm symphony. But I dealt with it because that's just life in the suburbs. So, last night around 9 p.m., I got this massive craving for nachos. Following my own rules, I threw on my hoodie and started my walk to the convenience store. The walk there was uneventful, just me enjoying the cool night air and dreaming about the warm, cheesy goodness awaiting me. On my way back, nachos in hand and already planning which Netflix show I'd watch while eating them, a police car pulled up beside me. The officer started by asking if he could have a word with me. When I asked if everything was okay, he explained that they'd received a call about a suspicious person in the area and asked where I was heading. I told him I lived here and was just walking back home with my nachos. He then asked to see my ID, and when I provided it, I asked what exactly made me suspicious. That's when the officer explained something bizarre. According to the caller, I had been seen walking around the neighborhood multiple times, and they had even provided security footage showing someone with my tattoos. Apparently, what made me suspicious was that I didn't look at my phone while walking, was always alone, and didn't walk a dog. I just stood there trying to process what I was hearing. The officer checked my ID, confirmed I lived just 2 blocks away, and seemed pretty embarrassed about the whole situation. That's when it hit me. One of my neighbors had not only been filming me, but had called the police multiple times because I wasn't conforming to their idea of what a normal walker should look like. They literally had footage of me, showing my distinctive tattoos, and instead of thinking, oh, that's just that person who lives down the street, they decided I was some kind of threat because I wasn't staring at my phone like a zombie. The officer filled me in that this wasn't the first time they'd received calls about me. Apparently, my neighbor had been building quite the case file on the suspicious walker who dared to be present in the moment instead of scrolling through social media. I asked the officer to clarify if I was really being considered suspicious just because I didn't walk a dog, didn't stare at my phone, and walked alone. When he confirmed that was indeed the caller's reasoning, I sarcastically asked if I should start wearing a sign saying, "Local resident just trying to lose weight," or maybe get my address tattooed on my forehead. The officer actually chuckled at my sarcasm and apologized for the trouble. He mentioned they'd have to have a word with my neighbor about making unnecessary calls to law enforcement. The next day, I did what any reasonable person would do. I printed out a bunch of small cards with "Yes, I live here" in big letters, along with a specific municipal code about false police reports and harassment. I now hand them out to any neighbor I see filming me or acting suspicious of my suspicious walking behavior. My neighbor got a stern warning from the police about wasting their resources. Apparently, they didn't appreciate being called out multiple times to investigate someone's completely legal walking habits. I found out which neighbor it was when they got served with a cease and desist letter from my lawyer. Turns out repeatedly filming someone and making false police reports can have consequences. Now I make sure to wave extra cheerfully at their security cameras during my nightly walks. I'm a woodworker by trade and I've been running my small workshop for about 15 years now. Guns aren't really my main thing, but I do own a few for recreational shooting and home defense. One of them was this carbine rifle that I had customized quite a bit, added a custom stock and replaced the retention pins with bolts because the original ones kept messing with the aim. About 6 months ago, someone broke into my workshop. They took quite a few of my tools and my carbine rifle. I filed a police report right away, but you know how these things usually go. They take the report, and that's the last you hear of it. I had pretty much given up hope of ever seeing any of my stuff again. Fast forward to last week, I needed a new belt sander since my old one was starting to give out, so I decided to check out this pawn shop downtown. that sometimes has good deals on tools. As I was browsing through their merchandise, something caught my eye in their gun display. I couldn't believe it. There was my carbine rifle, sitting right there with its custom stock and everything. I approached the counter where this younger guy was working. I politely asked him about the carbine rifle in the display. He asked what I wanted to know about it. I explained that it was actually my rifle, stolen from my workshop 6 months ago, and that I could prove it was mine because of the custom modifications I had made myself. The employee dismissed my claim, stating that they get similar claims all the time, and once they purchase an item, it becomes their property. When I requested that they run the serial number to verify my claim, he refused and told me I could buy it for $650. I refused to buy back my own stolen property and asked to speak with the manager. The manager came out, a middle-aged woman with that typical customer service smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When she asked about the problem, I explained about the stolen rifle, the police report I'd filed 6 months ago, and how I could prove it was mine because of the custom work. She responded condescendingly, insisting they were a legitimate business that doesn't deal in stolen goods, and that I'd have to purchase it like any other customer if I wanted it. I tried reasoning with her, acknowledging they had a business to run but explaining that this was my stolen property and all they needed to do was run the serial number. She refused, claiming they had no obligation to run serial numbers for everyone claiming ownership, and suggested I might be trying to scam them. At this point, I'd had enough of their attitude. I stepped outside and called the police department. While I waited, Karen kept giving me dirty looks through the window and even had the nerve to try to sell my rifle to another customer who came in. Fortunately, that person left without buying it. About 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived and asked about the situation. I explained everything, showed them my original police report from the theft, and described the custom modifications I'd made to the rifle. They went inside to speak with Karen, who suddenly wasn't looking so smug anymore. The officers ran the serial number and surprise, surprise, it matched my stolen property report. Karen's face turned red when she realized she couldn't talk her way out of this one. She tried to argue that they still needed to verify everything and couldn't just hand over merchandise without proper documentation. The officers told her that this was confirmed stolen property and she was required by law to surrender it to law enforcement. She protested about losing money since they had paid for the rifle, but the officers explained that it was a civil matter between the shop and whoever sold it to them, suggesting they review their purchasing procedures to avoid buying stolen property in the future. The police put a hold on the rifle since there weren't any detectives available at the time to fully process the case. Karen was fuming, but there wasn't anything she could do about it. When I was leaving, I heard her yelling at her employees about their intake procedures. A week later, I got a call from a detective who had reviewed my case. Not only did they recover my rifle, but they managed to track down the person who sold it to the pawn shop through their records. Turns out this person had been involved in several other burglaries in the area. They arrested him, and during the investigation they found some of my stolen tools in his garage. Karen's pawn shop got hit with a fine for failing to properly document the purchase and not following proper procedures for checking serial numbers on firearms. I heard that she had to undergo a full audit of all their firearms transactions. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.